My name is Ana Beatriz. I'm a Brazilian sociologist currently working at UNSW here in Sydney, and my main topics are time and social theory. This talk is a summary of some reflections published in a recent paper and aims to bring some concepts from Schutz to contribute with the ongoing debate on social theory and media theory. The original paper has two parts. In the first one, I focus on a possible acceleration of time and the answer that Schutz would give for this debate. And in the second, I discuss the relation of time and memory. In this talk specifically, I will explore just the first part. That's the relation between time, media, and acceleration. Schutz is an author that written before Twitter, as everyone knows. So it brings a challenge, but at the same time, I believe it brings lots of benefits. Once he is one of the most productive authors of social theory and designed a really broad theoretical framework involving many aspects of social life. And his debate on time is not only descriptive, but he opened a deep and conceptual dialogue that I believe is useful for understanding new social realities. So let's start with a brief introduction to show why I chose to do this work and what's my main motivation. Sounds like a common sense or a common ground, the idea that time would today be at a different pace compared to a few years ago, and that time is accelerating. It's not uncommon to see people on the streets and in casual meetings commenting on how fast time is passing and how they do not have time for activities A or B, or how much time pressures them at a faster pace. Within a double hermeneutic process, the elaboration of time acceleration has become one of the main themes relating to the new communication technology and time as well. And this theme generally reflects the hypothesis of acceleration of individual experience and the central arguments linked to the ability of technological devices to accelerate process and interactions, compressing stimulus and response to a temporality that is increasingly close to face-to-face contact. After having a very careful look at the bibliography, we could say that the problem of acceleration and changing the pace of time lies in some good questions. What's the role of new technologies in this discussion? Are new technologies the cause of the acceleration? What are the consequences of time acceleration for the lives of individuals in particular and societies in general? And how can we organize this discussion without neglecting the role of new technologies, but resisting the explanatory impoverishment of technological determinism? Many authors have been thinking about these questions, however, using as presupposition the a priori existence of acceleration. That is, they start from the given existence of acceleration, and from it think of the cause and consequence. None of them question whether or not there is a change in the pace of time, nor do they question why, as individuals and institutions, we have this feeling. The problem is that this kind of analysis leaves unexpanded the deep connection of the speed of time and the interpretation and analysis of the ways in which technology has affected our relationship with time. What we're going to do in this first part of our presentation is ask ourselves just that, returning to the starting point. What causes us as individuals and societies to feel that time is accelerating? And how can Schutz help us to answer these questions? We know that the time, objectively speaking, is not changing. We're still with 24 hours and each hour with 6 minutes and 8 minutes with 6 seconds. So why do we feel that it's accelerating? My main argument in this part is that the new technologies and new medias propel the individuals out of the pure durée into the space-time dimension, and it's marked by a reflection on time. As we are encouraged to step out of this flow and reflect on our own experience over time, the sense of acceleration sets in, as well as the social pressure that comes as a consequence of it. So let's develop. In his discussion of time, Schutz uses a distinction previously sketched by Bernecker. He proposed two dimensions. There is one dimension of experience and one dimension of space and time. The difference between them is that the first is the pure duration, and the second, we have discontinuous emergence in the space and time. The individual and his ego can be in both dimensions, depending on the moment and the situation. In the dimension of pure durée, of flow, the ego dissolves into continuous transitions and does not differentiate between different temporal moments and does not reflect upon time. Already in the spatial-temporal dimension, the individual leaves the pure durée and claims the reflection on time and the experience with it. Based on it, Schutz state that all distinctions, all attempts to separate individual experience from the unit of duration are artificial. For when I immerse myself in my stream of consciousness, in my durée, I do not find any kind of differentiated experience. It lies up, goes out, new one appears, and other disappears from the old, making it impossible for the actor to distinguish between now and past, since experience is a one-way and irreversible flow. Of course, it's possible to know, for example, that the time passed and we are older now, but does not mean that we know exactly when it happened, once we are within the flow. In other words, make it easier, there are two dimensions. A spatial-temporal dimension, which is the dimension where there are reflection and a retrospective look at life and phenomena, as well as clipped assessment of time, and a dimension of experience within which everything is flow. In the first, there is a discontinuous image. In the second, a pure durée. For Schutz, the difference between both are conscience. If the basis for the difference between them is not objective but present in the stream of consciousness, it would not be entirely correct to say that in one dimension there is a difference between successor and previous moments, while in the other there is none. In fact, in one dimension there is awareness of this difference, and in another there is not. If it's possible to make an effort to understand his elaboration in our daily lives, so let's try. Often, we are just submerged in the pure durée of everyday life. We do not necessarily realize the passage of time and do not distinguish between present, past, and future so clearly. However, when we stop to reflect on our existence, sometimes on a birthday, on a festive date, we leave the durée and are inserted into a spatial and temporal dimension, which leads us to categorize facts and events in order to distinguish space-time variation. This is quite interesting because it assumes that the end of a phase does not depend on the phase itself. In other words, the idea of the end is not ontological to the idea of phase. It seems to depend on the actor interpretation and of how they live their experience. That is, time seems to be strictly linked to the idea of experience. What Schutz does not systematize, however, is how this dimensional passages happen in everyday life. Moreover, Schutz does not elaborate whether, depending on the society or the number of stimulus the individual receives, these outputs in the spatial-temporal dimension become more or less frequent. I take the conceptualization elaborated by them choose as a basis to thinking about acceleration time. The acceleration would no longer be thought as an obvious assumption or socially given, but as a complex mechanism through which individual consciousness are stimulated to move from the pure flow of social experience to continuous reflection on time and space. Several studies highlighted the number of stimulus as one of the most striking effects of accelerating technological development and how the amount of information produced and circulated on the internet exhausts human consumption processing capacity. Informational abundance in this sense is just one of the elements that pressure conscience from the number of stimulus. This process also occurs concerning the intensity of interactions established in daily life, in ways of conducting in front of and within different virtual environments, in advertisements and in notifications for various applicatives, among others. This reflection, when performed consciously and repeatedly, brings the constant sensation of the passage of time, and therefore replaces the idea of acceleration with the idea of increasing reflexivity and entering the space-time dimension frequently. In other words, we are arguing that the individual suffers an expulsion of pure durée, as described above, and starts to reflect about space and time dimensions, having the sensation, the feeling of acceleration more than before. The richness of Schutz's formulation lies in its theoretical conceptual capacity and therefore explanatory power of a new social phenomenon. If before the popularization of the internet, as mentioned above, individuals performed this reflection exercise only the face of a death, of a loved one, or on commemorative dates, the exercise now is done daily, bringing individual and collective pressure and acceleration. The question that arises in the face of this new formulation is why or how do new technologies increase stimulus and demands for individuals to move out of the way and continuous flow into the space-time dimension? The answer to this lies in the broader discussions about new technologies and their impacts on the everyday life. After all, much has been said about how the new devices have transformed the way we deal with memories, dating, time control, and etc. Being connected at all times to devices that forcefully make us record memories and dealing concretely and reflexively with the themes of space and time forces into the space-time dimension. Examples are notifications of birthdays, events, memories made by social networks such as Facebook, instant markings made by mobile devices about their location, space, and time, notifications on instant message applications, among others. These stimulus force us to move more and more constantly out of our dimension of experience and drive us both to the most frequent reflections about space and time. Just to make clear and conclude, according to Schutz, we have two dimensions, one dimension of experience and one spatial-temporal dimension. In the first, the individual just live, not notice the time and its flow. But if the individual stop and think about it, he enters in another dimension, in which there are reflection and retrospective look to the past. Historically, we make this movement in special dates, and in these dates, people used to make some consideration about time. Using Schutz to think about acceleration of time, we argue that not necessarily time is accelerating as the authors are assuming, but actually the social media with all its functionalities and tools make us leave one dimension and enter another dimension every day. The result is the feeling that time is accelerating and the feeling that we have less time. So why is it important? It's a contribution to conceptualize and leave the pure description of the phenomena and bring together social theory and media studies. So you can ask just one concept. Actually, the paper I mentioned bring another one about memory, and I'm now with a book contract to launch until next July to talk about actually all the appropriation of Schutz to media studies. And yeah, so I intend to expand and bring more clarity and conceptualization for more issues and topics in media. So thanks for your attention and hope you have enjoyed.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. We've got about 4 minutes for questions. So does anyone have any questions? Does anybody want to ask something? Anyone? Julia, are you raising your hand?
Can I ask how I would, so I would just ask a question like that because I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay, yeah, go.
But I see a hand went up with Karen Farquharson.
Did you want to go first or did you?
No, I didn't. I just needed to know how to do it.
Does anyone have any questions? Nobody has anything they want to ask?
Can I make a statement?
You absolutely can.
Just as you were going through, and it's just a thing that came to mind was when we first started to use emails as academics and how people were starting work an hour early to do the emails, because before then we would have to make contact with people by telephones and things like that. So how we then felt that we were increasing our days, which we really were. I mean, I'm talking a long time ago. I'm an old girl, okay? So there are experiences that technology does do that. And I mean, I get up every morning now and I look at all sorts of news from all over the world. And I do that earlier than I begin my day. So the media for me does impact my experience of time in that sense. I don't know if that's useful, but it's just commenting on it because I've been through a lot of different time periods. I was born in 1944, you know, so I've experienced very different things along the way. I wasn't born into this.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have grown through it and changed and, you know, developed with it.
Yeah.
Does anyone else, we've got time for another quick statement or question? Or if not, we can leave it until the end and you can see if anything kind of comes to mind over the next kind of the rest of the presentations. Okay, if we don't have anyone wanting to speak just yet, we will pass on to Ashleigh and Arij now, who are talking about Foreign Thugs and the New Menace, the Racialized Constructions of Gangs in Australian News Media Discourse, which I'm very interested to hear about. So if you'd like to go, but can you remember to turn your chat feature on so that you can see?
Yes, I can see that. Thank you, Kathy. And also Karen's going to send us a text when we're getting close to our time as well, so that'll be helpful. I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. Oh,
yeah, that would be great.
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Hold on, let me see if I can change that.
There we go.
Can you share
Otherwise, let me try.
Who can share?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
So, is that working?
No.
Oh, no, here we go.
Yeah.
Should be now. Okay, awesome.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Ashleigh Haw. I'm going to be presenting with one of my colleagues, Beatriz Martins. We're both research assistants at the University of Melbourne in the School of Social and Political Sciences, and we're working with Karen Farquharson on research that explores constructions of racially and ethnically diverse groups in Australian newspapers over a 10-year period. So I do just firstly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting. So for me, that's the Yalukut Weelam clan of the Boon Wurrung, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, including any Indigenous people who may be joining us today. And we're going to be talking about one component of our project so far, so very preliminary, kind of quick and dirty look at some of the findings that have come up so far, and we've looked at how the term gang specifically has been used in different ways in Australian news discourse over this 10-year corpus of news articles that we've collected, and we've analysed that through a form of corpus linguistics called topic modelling using Python, so very exciting stuff. So just a bit of an idea of what the literature is suggesting so far. So scholars have long observed and commented on how whiteness has historically produced social understandings about the racialised other in Australian society. And that other is often constructed as someone who is a threat and naturally prone to violence, and therefore needs to be sort of civilised by this dominant white society. And those things have been very much observed in the discourse surrounding Lebanese and African gangs, for instance. So in this context, that racialised use of the gangs trope does often kind of serve as this mechanism for othering. And it reflects these calls for racially diverse groups. So notably Muslims, Africans and Lebanese communities to renounce the full presence of their blackness in order to make white Australia more comfortable. And so in the literature, there's also been this really strong theme surrounding militarisation, which is often through the use of war metaphors. So you see really strong links to anti-Muslim racism, anti-immigration sentiments, and also support for punitive policy responses to migrants and asylum seekers in a lot of this discourse around these kind of criminalisation of gangs and different gang groups. And so it's sort of been against this political backdrop that many Australia's first Sudanese refugees started to arrive, and many of them faced a lot of hostility arising from this kind of war on terror narrative in that post 9/11 period. So not surprisingly, Sudanese people, especially young people, have featured really heavily in news discourse surrounding gangs in recent years. But the interesting thing in the literature is that there's no clear consensus on what actually constitutes a gang and how do we define a gang, what different attributes do gangs have, and why are some groups of gangs talked about so differently to others. And so there's this growing body of research that's exploring the different ways that racially diverse communities are criminalised and othered in news discourse, but we don't know a lot about how the gang label itself is being deployed and what kinds of differences we can see when we compare non-racialised gangs. So for instance, that's your kind of underworld gangs and bikie gangs, for instance. When we compare those groups with those more racialised gangs, so your Lebanese gangs, African youth, refugees, asylum seekers, and so on. And so, and that's led us to explore these different research questions. So firstly, we were looking at, in general, how is the term represented in news media? What kinds of articles are coming up and what are they telling us? What types of gangs are racialised and in what way? What kind of language is used? And are certain ethnic groups featured in coverage of gangs more often than others? Is there more focus on certain racial identities? And how is the language used to construct gangs in Australia different between these racialised and non-racialised groups? And then more pointedly, I guess, what does this actually tell us about that broader socio-political construction of ethnic gangs and of gangs in general in Australia, and of how these different groups are criminalised. So I'm going to pass on to my colleague Reid now. She's going to talk a little bit about the methods that we're using and some of the preliminary observations that we've had so far.
Awesome, thank you so much, Ash. And hi everyone, my name is Reid, and I'll try and whiz through some of this analysis. So our data set is made up of 41,557 news items. And so we have 10 years worth of articles from the 1st of January 2010 until the 31st of December 2019 from 6 Australian broadsheet papers. And our keyword search was gang. So all items containing words starting with gang are in this really huge set that we've collected. It was downloaded from Nexus Uni, and I'll be speaking with you in a moment about the analysis of this huge set. So Ash, I'll get you to move to the next slide. Thank you. In terms of analysing the data quantitatively, we're using computer-assisted analysis on Python to identify topic models, which are groups of words that appear together in articles throughout the entire corpus. So in a moment, I'll be running through a bit of a summary of the topic modelling findings, but before we get into that, I'll briefly explain what we can get out of topic modelling. So remember, all of the articles have the word gang in them. So the topic modelling helps us see what patterns arise across the 41,000 plus articles in something of an objective way. We can answer questions like, what are the most common themes found in the articles about gangs in Australia? Is the term gang associated with certain racial and ethnic groups more than others? What language is used to describe different racial and ethnic groups in the context of gangs? And so a great thing about topic modelling is that it gives you some key focus points right off the bat, because really what you find are just words listed together based on how often they're found in the same article. I'll get you to move to the next slide, Ash, thank you. So in terms of a quick summary of our topic modelling findings, very quickly, across the whole data set, we found 53 distinct topics, or well, Python found 53 distinct topics. 7 discuss underworld gangs, 5 discuss bikie gangs, and 5 look at racialized depictions of gangs, or depict gangs in a racialized way. And maybe unsurprisingly, the term gang itself was commonly associated with crime, violence, and policing. Just onto the next slide, thank you. In terms of the racialized depictions of gangs, what we pulled out of the last 10 years of reporting was in relation to theft and its association with so-called apex gangs, African youth in relation to crime and violence, Islam and its association, as Ash was speaking to earlier, with military, security and war more broadly, and then immigration, which really focused on detention and deportation. And remember, again, all these topics are in relation to the search term gang. So Islam isn't just generally included, it's in relation to the word gang. And moving on to immigration and Islam, looking at immigration and Islam and looking at these word clouds, we see some words are bigger than others. So the bigger the word size, the higher the frequency of the word in relation to other words in the topic. For example, the word immigration, which is really big in topic 39, is mentioned just over 200 times across all the data, but just under 200 times, 200 of those times are in relation to other words in the topics. Whereas the word minister, which is a little bit smaller in topic 39, is mentioned around 500 times across the 41,000 papers, all the 41,000 news items, but around 80 of those times are in relation to other words in topic 39. And you can also see all the different words in relation to each other across topic 39 and topic 13. Moving on to Apex and African youth gangs, we think it's pretty important to pause at the use of the term Apex gang. So Apex gang has been racialized through persistent association with African and sometimes Pacific Islander young people here in Victoria, and often using descriptors like of South Sudanese descent or predators or thugs in relation to Apex gang. So in this way, Apex gang has been a substitute word which enables journalists and commentators and politicians to use the term in place of racial descriptors like, you know, African or ethnic or Black. And you might be able to see it right there in topic 11. And so when it comes to the topic modelling, we found it to be really useful for huge data sets. And the word clouds that you see in this slide are especially useful because we can visualise important clusters of words across thousands and thousands of articles in, you know, in an instant. And so the topic modelling also allows us to hone in on important themes according to a huge data set. We can also discover topics of interest for a more qualitative comparative analysis. But I think that's all from me. I'll hand over to Ash now to finish up.
Okay, so just to do a very quick conclusion. So even though these are very preliminary, these findings that we've sort of started to unpack here are really, what they're really showing us is these different ways that gangs are racialized and how they are, and the different terminology that comes up in these depictions over this 10-year period. It's a massive corpus that we're looking at, and so and what is really interesting is how these discussions are so closely connected to crime, policing and security discourses and the specific racial groups that are coming up, African youth, Muslims, refugees and asylum seekers. So obviously the next steps of the project, and we're welcoming any feedback and comments that you have that will help us sort of direct this further, which would be great. But we're going to do more in-depth comparative analysis of the different racialized depictions and compare depictions of non-white gangs in more detail to the sort of more white-centric gangs, so the kind of organised crime groups, and doing that through some other computational linguistics tools like topic modelling, co-location analysis, and an analysis of like sentiment analysis, which basically just tells you if the articles are negative versus positive, which we imagine most will likely be negative. But also some more in-depth qualitative analysis of just a selection from the Australian corpus to really go in depth at the actual discourses themselves and how they're being used and what they tell us about broader kind of social power structures that we're working within. But as I said before, we'd love your feedback about where we could potentially go with the analysis. And all three of us are here, so to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was awesome. We have 45 minutes for questions, so does anybody want to ask or start? Can you take your screen down?
Yes, there we go, stop share, there we go.
I can see everyone, there we go. Does anyone have a question? Is anyone, I can't tell if you're raising your hand, so if you do have a question, unmute yourself and say hi. I can't tell if you're clapping or raising your hand. Does anyone have any? I mean, I personally have a question, if that's all right. Do you want to go first, Sarah? Sarah, you go first and I'll ask mine afterwards. There we go.
Sure. I'm sitting on Kulin lands on Wurundjeri country, and I'm Sarah from Deakin University. Mine was just really a comment. Thanks, Arij, Ash and Karen. I was taking pictures because this data's been really helpful, I guess, to really prove the experiences of South Sudanese young people in particular, that they're not making it up how many times African gangs has really appeared in the media. And I'm not sure if it was your study or a different similar study, but I read that African gangs appeared, or Apex appeared 145 times in 1 year in one newspaper. Was that your study? I think it was in 2018. So it just really helps to know the frequency of it, and that it's not a mistake, I guess, and it's not an accident that it happened. So thank you. And I guess with next steps, my research, PhD research, I'm looking at, I guess, how South Sudanese young people, what they're doing with this information to develop counter narratives. So using hip hop in particular, which they've sort of chosen. So some young people ran a protest at Channel 7 who were hip hop artists. Arij probably may know who they are. But yeah, there's lots of things that young people are doing to counteract this as well, using their own agency.
Yeah, that's good. Did you want to comment on that, Karen or Arij?
That's really, your work sounds really interesting, and we should stay in touch.
Would love to. Thank you.
Definitely. No, and the article you're talking about the different times apex gangs came up in 1 year, I'd love to check that out as well. So I'll try and find that. It wasn't us, but it sounds really, really relevant. So.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, are you noticing any difference between the different newspapers, like just in terms of the volume of coverage you're getting?
We haven't gone into any detail yet on the differences between the papers, but that is one of the next steps that we're going to do. And I think the Python analysis does enable us to do that, because we could separate them out and then look at the different words that come up. And it just kind of really unofficially and anecdotally, when I was going through and sorting through a lot of them, I did notice that the articles in the West Australian and the Courier Mail, for example, I noticed more use of words like thugs and like that new menace term and stuff like that was coming up like a lot in the headlines with those ones, whereas the headlines for the Age and the Australian and those ones were a little bit more about some kind of political issue, and then the African gangs issue was somewhere within the body of the article. But again, that's very anecdotal. Until we've had a chance to really analyse it, we won't be able to really answer that properly, but it's interesting.
No, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Okay, I think we might need to move on, but we will have time for some questions at the end. So
can I jump in here?
Yes.
You don't have to introduce yourself.
Thank you.
I'll briefly jump in as chair. To introduce the chair, Beatriz Martins will present on making a home, house metaphors and symbolic violence in Australian press reports on immigration.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen with you. So let me try that. I'm just going to open my chat box. Okay, alrighty. So let me start. So this presentation just covers a very small aspect of my PhD research, and it's focused on the metaphors that construct the nation as a house within Australian press reports on immigration since Federation. Now, it's a very quick outline of the presentation. The background and the methodology is going to be very brief, just to allow more time to focus on the data itself. So the theoretical framework for this presentation is Bourdieu's concept of symbolic power and violence. So Bourdieu asserts that linguistic relations are always relations of symbolic power. And symbolic power is the power to assert a dominant worldview or symbolic system, which naturalizes and legitimizes other structures of power within society. And when that system is imposed on others without the power to resist, it's a form of symbolic violence, which helps maintain the power relations that permit the symbolic violence in the first place. And the research takes a critical discourse analysis methodological approach, which is a problem-oriented, interdisciplinary approach focused on power and dominance with a critical commitment. And it utilizes aspects of critical metaphor theory, which originates in the work of Lakoff and Johnson. And they contend that metaphor is central to how we conceptualize the world. And building on this, Charteris Black highlights that while metaphor use is ubiquitous and central, the choice of specific metaphor is ideological, serving a persuasive function. So data were collected from 15 sample periods over this 117-year period, and the sample periods were between 2 and 4 years. It comes from 3 newspapers for each period as listed, with the Australian replacing the Argus after it closed. And data were collected through keyword searches on Trove and Factiva databases and via microfilm when no databases had coverage. And metaphors were coded within NVivo and then analysed to situate them within their broader discursive context. And the data for this presentation comprises 178 house metaphors from the White Australia period and 786 house metaphors from the Multicultural Australia period. So turning to the White Australia period, the creation of the Australian nation can also be understood as a form of symbolic production, with the founders of the new Australian state engaged in the creation of forms of symbolic power to define the categorizations and limits of the new kind of imagined community. And this symbolic creation of the nation was often expressed through house metaphors within the press. Now, the nation as house conceptual metaphor constructs the nation as a singular bounded dwelling in which the population lives, with doors and gates through which others are enter or are barred. And most common in this period with door-gate metaphors. So looking at door-gate, and that's what we have here, despite the massive British immigration in this period, only 3 refer to British migrants, while over 2/3 explicitly did not, so either European or non-European. And the rest were non-specified, although a number of these were obviously not British, things like foreigners, aliens, strangers. So this demonstrates that the nation's doors or gates were generally opened or closed to those seen as external to the nation, namely the non-British. So the nation house can be understood as being imagined not just as a physically bounded location, but also as a racial, cultural community, making it a potent elaboration of symbolic power. And just having a little look. So house metaphors peaked in the 1920s, when Southern Europeans were often debated as being racially distinct and threatening. So in this first extract, we've got this repeated use of we and our, which constructs the national in-group in contrast to the Mediterranean races, who are innately racially different and through their weakening capacity inferior. And 30 years later, the metaphor persisted, although in lower numbers and less vividly, as the second extract demonstrates. And this correlates with the tentative acceptance of Italians as racially white. And they decreased further in the 1960s as the racial acceptability of Southern Europeans gets kind of confirmed. However, in the multicultural Australia period, 786 house metaphors were found, with home or doorgate the most common. And through the flagging of certain groups as external, the position of the groups not commented on as the true inhabitants of the nation house is naturalized. And so the primary metaphor was home, and this most commonly referred to asylum seekers, with other non-white migration accounting for 17%, and just 5% referred to either British or Australians, and most commonly to describe coming home. And there were 3 main themes to home metaphors which cut across these different groups. So the first is of calling Australia home, or feeling at home, and this was one of the only metaphors where Europeans were also often remarked upon. And there is a difference between calling a place a home and actually being at home. So the first suggests a process, while the latter suggests a state. And notably, there were very few references to immigrants simply being at home, reflecting the more conditional homely belonging possessed by most immigrants, in contrast to the governmental belonging of the dominant group within society, with the power to dictate who should be allowed to feel at home in the nation, an expression of governmental and thus symbolic power. For asylum seekers, a more common framing was of being given a home. And there is a difference, again, between calling somewhere home and being given a home. The first is a right, while the second is a gift, for which asylum seekers are expected to be grateful. And giving asylum seekers a home was rooted in this ideal of Australia as a compassionate nation. And this is evident in the first 2 extracts, which highlight Australia's morals and ethics, alongside noting that they've contributed handsomely to refugee programs. But this partiality of acceptance is revealed in the last extract, when the refugees failed to reciprocate correctly, instead causing these problems that Melbourne is grappling with, highlighting their ingratitude for the gift alongside implicitly their unworthiness for it. And the second main theme referred to the forcible repatriation of unwanted asylum seekers. And there's a real delegitimizing of asylum seeker claims embedded in demands to send them home. So they're referred to as boat people, or the wrong people, or as criminals, and contrasted with genuine refugees of good character, presumably those who are invited, who are given a home. And by using the euphemistic home, the violence embedded within the act was obscured and the actions legitimated. And a third theme referenced concerns about visitors, mostly Asian students, not going home after their visa ended. So again, home is used to signify a place assigned to a person, rather than a right that can be claimed. Hold on, went too far. Okay, so 1/3 of house metaphors reference some variation of door or gate. So looking just here at open door metaphors, the majority of open door metaphors that collocated directly with people refer to either asylum seeker or other non-white migration. Just 3% refer to European migration, and significantly, it was never used to refer specifically to British immigration. And so the data demonstrates that the doors are opened or not to immigrants who are not seen as intrinsically belonging to the nation house. So white Anglos, and indeed most Europeans, were not remarked upon. And closed door showed a very similar trajectory. Thinking about open door though, the most common collocation was not with people, but with policy. And this was underpinned by the understanding that a completely open door policy was not desirable. And a further third of open door references collocated directly with either Australia or our doors, strongly evoking the nation house. And then moving on to another common metaphor was backdoor. And this was often collocated with terms like sneak in and devious, and it was used to highlight illegitimacy, flagging racially other immigrants. And it was centered on three things. Firstly, fears of Asians, mainly students, but sometimes tourists, trying to stay permanently in the country. So again, there's this flagging of illegitimacy in the contrast with genuine students, with illegitimate immigrants abusing the system. And notably, such concerns were not raised about European backpackers or students who were also overstaying in very large numbers. Secondly, it framed concerns about Asians or Pacific Islanders using New Zealand as a means of indirect entry. So in the extract, it talks about New Zealanders who were born in third countries. So despite possessing the same visa status as those born in New Zealand, they are unwelcome, while those born in New Zealand are not. And finally, it was used to construct asylum seekers arriving by boat as not using proper entry methods. So, just to conclude, during the White Australia period, the nation house functioned not just as a physically bounded location, but also delineated a racial cultural community. So house metaphors were then expressions of symbolic power through which racially differentiated ideas of belonging and exclusion centered on an Anglo-white core were metaphorically expressed and naturalized. But this is complicated by the broad social shifts that occurred once the policy ended, particularly the increasing immigration of non-white people and the adoption of multiculturalism. Yet despite this, within the nation as house metaphor, there remained a distinction between immigrants, although metaphors tended to center whiteness as opposed to Anglo-whiteness. Significantly though, home metaphors are one of the few areas where a differentiation between European and Anglo immigrants remained, suggesting that despite the overall emphasis on whiteness, Anglo-whiteness remains at the core of the nation home. But the nation's doors gates were more open, were more straightforward, referring primarily to those not from Northern Europe, demonstrating that the nation house continues to be constructed as a fundamentally white space in general. And we can understand this persistent flagging of the nation in racial terms as not just expressions of symbolic power, but also of symbolic violence, through which a racialized hierarchical structuring of Australian society, which continues to center a dominant white core, is naturalized, and in the process undermining the potential for more inclusive understandings of Australian national identity. And that is the end. And I will stop sharing so that I can see everyone. Hello.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Finished.
That was really interesting and actually perfectly sets up our presentation. So,
excellent.
Thank you for doing that. Any questions for Kathy? Or comments?
Can I ask things?
Oh yeah, Ash, please.
Well, just firstly, I'm really excited to read about this, so I'm going to be furiously looking for your PhD in the repository so I can find out more, because I'm such a language nerd. But no, I was really interested in when you were talking about how there's this good versus bad. You've mentioned briefly that kind of good versus bad refugee idea that's kind of coming through, and that it seems like in your research a lot of it is about how they've arrived, so the right processes versus the backdoor kind of narrative. Yeah, very much. I just was curious, did you see a lot of discussions of this, the same kind of idea about like good versus bad binary, but in relation to refugees showing gratitude to Australia for being so generous and giving them this resettlement gift? I've come across a bit of that lately, and I wondered if there was anything in the metaphors. More in the sense of when we're talking about giving them a home. So there's lots of these things where we've given them a home, and there is this idea that they should be grateful, because it's often articulated around the fact that they've been given this home and how generous we are. And there's no mention being made of refugee rights or obligations or any of these things which should be, it shouldn't be being framed around we're being so generous. We're actually fulfilling our obligations, and we're not actually doing a very good job of it. So the fact that we're doing anything, it's very much centered around, it's rooted in this idea of the kind of humanitarian Australian, which changes the emphasis very much, I think. So yeah, you do see this idea that they should be grateful, particularly if you look at that last extract. It's like, oh, well, they're causing problems. We've given them a home and they're causing problems. How dare they? There's almost this expectation that
they need to be these models, you know, model minority. They're not allowed to have any problems or make any mistakes or do anything wrong, which we get a lot with immigrant groups, you know, racialized immigrant groups. They're expected to be, you know, these perfect model immigrants. And, you know, I mean, we see that the same with Muslim groups, all being expected to talk about how they don't agree with what's just happened every time there's been a terror attack or any kind of issue. You know, there is this very, very kind of double standard in terms of acceptance, I think. Oh, only when someone becomes a footballer or they're ours, and now when doing well, but if struggling, they're known by their national identity. Very much, yeah. It is very much a sense if they're one of us, if they're doing something that we want, and otherwise, well, they're a this or a that or a refugee. And people don't ever get to stop being refugees, it seems, in Australia. You know, even when they become Australian, they're still a refugee, which is problematic as well, I think.
Bernice, any other questions, comments, thoughts?
No. Okay, how about I take over? Hold on, let me just escape that. Okay, I will take over again and I will introduce Jora. So Jora Broerse, is that right?
Great.
Is doing presenting a paper on the belonging of Dutchies in Australia, comparing white Australia policy to multiculturalism. Can I just ask you, Jora, to make sure you've got your chat thing open so I can message you?
Excellent. Yes, it's open, thanks.
Take it away.
Thank you. I'll share my screen with you and enlarge it. Although I do need my notes alongside, so I'll leave it like this. I hope you can see this properly. Oh, I can close this. Beautiful. All right, thank you, Kathy, for introducing. It feels like we're dancing in a duet. I'm based at the land of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'm presenting on a research project that is initiated by Associate Professor Corinne Dekker, who is in the room currently, from RMIT University. And we are working together with the Joint Associate Professor, Nunja Peters, Peter, it's more a Dutch pronunciation, I think, who is based in Amsterdam, and also from the Curtin University. So, again, thank you for introducing the topic, because we're talking about white Australia and multiculturalism policy as well, and asking questions around identity and belonging among Dutch Australian immigrants. So why Dutch immigrants? Around 300,000 Australians claim Dutch ancestry, and there's quite a lot of diversity within this group, including time of migration, migration pathways, reasons for migration, and only a third of Dutch migrants speak Dutch at home. In the 1950s, the Dutch migrants were praised for their adaptability and invisibility. And there's been little research on how this ideal type of immigrant has experienced issues of identity and belonging. So that's why we're asking this question of two different sets of migrants who arrived during assimilation policies and multiculturalism policies. And we're doing this by looking at Sing in Dutch choir. This is a Dutch community choir in Melbourne, meeting in normal circumstances every week. And during actually Corona lockdown, the choir continued singing and meeting mainly through Zoom, and the choir saw numbers rising. So that's good. Everyone who is interested in Dutch culture or singing in Dutch is welcome at this choir, and some members were born in Australia, some overseas, some are fluent in the Dutch language, whereas others want to learn to speak the language or get to learn the culture more in general. So again, most members have Dutch ancestry, some do not. Corinne, in fact, is an active member of the choir. And in normal circumstances, again, the choir performs a few times per year, mostly at Dutch festivals, like the Tulip Festival or in the My Care, elderly care homes. And in September 2019, the choir, in collaboration with the local council in Melbourne Hills, organized a one-day sing-along music event. It was very intimate event with about 30 visitors, including the choir members. And just like the choir members, the visitors of the event had different backgrounds and various connections with the Netherlands. All shared an interest in doing, learning, or hearing Dutch. And most visitors were actually singing along with this choir, following the lyrics on the handouts, and visitors were invited to bring artifacts that reminded them of their home in the Netherlands and gave them an opportunity to share immigration experiences. So people brought maps of their hometowns, a beer, in fact, a cookie box or milking drinking cups. So very everyday items. And visitors and choir members shared personal memories. And these memories that were shared established connections among people. And this event is central to our data collection. Corinne, again, as choir member, and me, as a visitor, participated in the event. And towards the end of the day, people were invited to take part in an interview. In total, we were able to do 10 interviews, with 5 people migrated during the White Australia policy and 5 more recently during the multiculturalism policy. And I must note that this time of migration also led to the different demographics and immigration pathways. So interviewees who migrated during the White Australia policy were older, had lower socioeconomic statuses and different jobs upon arrival. Interviewees who migrated when multiculturalism policy was implemented were younger at the time of the interviews, although their age when migrating was quite similar, and were higher educated. And the two groups were faced with different sort of integration experiences. So their ideas of identity and belonging reflect that. So the question we're asking is how federal immigration policy is reflected in people's understanding and experiences of identity and belonging, with the community music making day as an entry point for data collection, but also as a place that facilitates expression of ethnic identity and potentially where belonging is fostered. So immigration policy is part of nation building. What kind of nation states do settled people, and in this case, colonizers, envision? And what do migrants, and how do migrants fit into this picture? Particularly the white, sort of well-fitted migrants. And so abstract ideas of nation building have direct consequences on the personal level, particularly so for migrants from non-Anglo-Saxon backgrounds who will have to navigate this new ethnic culture or have to navigate their parents' non-Anglo-Saxon culture for second-generation migrants. So it's good to mention here that immigrant recruitment in Australia is primarily for the recruitment of Australian economy, as Nonya's research focuses on. And I think this audience is very well equipped with, if it comes to defining assimilation and multiculturalism, but both forms of integration are forms of integration, with assimilation leaves little room for cultural expression, be it ethnic, religious, other than the dominant one, whereas with the official reading of multiculturalism, immigrants are given freedom, space to express non-dominant cultures in the public and private spheres. Once multiculturalism was introduced in the late 90s, Dutch migrants in Australia were able to maintain their shared culture and meet in Dutch clubs, churches, choirs. And while there's been multicultural policy for decades, it seems that this holds true only for those that adhere to Australian values. And second generation migrants, people who do not fit into this picture racially or in religious terms, are still encouraged not to openly display their cultural origin, as many researchers have shown, including what we're hearing in this presentation session. All right. So, and then there's been a critique on multiculturalism being part of two cultures, sometimes conflicting cultures, a critique on multiculturalism, most famously by Hash, and there remains an ethnic hierarchy, with a very recently published article that popped up in my Twitter feed today on white privilege among highly skilled women immigrant workers in Australia. So this idea of white privilege is still very much present. So how to conceptualize identity and belonging? We're looking at stories and the meaning given to Dutch culture when in Australia. And this is coming through in the findings, which I'll go to in a minute. But first, what don't we know? Why are we looking at this? So we're looking at the impact of policy types on identity and belonging among Dutch migrants, and the intergenerational differences between first and second migration immigrants, and the connection between these two. So how do current second generation migrants cope with decisions their parents have made who migrated during the assimilation policy? And then the idea of seeing community music as actively performing an ethnic identity or belonging. And so how memories are shared. Okay. So the findings is presented in mainly three themes: reasons for moving to Australia, Dutch identity and belonging, and participation in Dutch community music making day. So whereas the first 5 interviews with migrants who came during the White Australia policy were more working class, different jobs and homes, they lived at many different places, they raised children mainly in English, and there's a few quotes along the side here. Maria, who is blamed by their children by not speaking Dutch at home, which was in fact a difficult decision to make. And then there's these coming out stories by members who joined the Dutch choir saying, I ignored them for a while. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do anything had to do with Dutch community, and the Australian wives make it harder, apparently. Then the other group of interviewees are more expats and highly skilled migrants. Some have social ties before moving, and they're saying it's okay to be Dutch. I feel if I tell someone you're Dutch, often they respond by telling you that they have Dutch heritage too. And in this group we found, in terms of identity and belonging, is that this bilingualism was actually encouraged, and although there remained this cultural cringe, as Petra explains, but also a sort of ambiguity in terms of not always being comfortable speaking English in public, for example. Okay, being mindful of the time, I'm jumping to the final slides. This is a website which I perhaps can show later, where we present the stories in a more accessible manner. And some concluding remarks, if we're looking at our question on identity and belonging. So the interview responses are pretty much in line with the policy eras and how we traditionally define these eras and the effects of policy, but they remain contested. And it's still about fitting in, if I make quotes, Kathy. The Anglo-whiteness remains the dominant idea of what home is. And this has probably policy implications, and we hope to show the importance of these ethnic community events by demonstrating their identity and fostering belonging. Nanya will I'm looking at the future research and exhibition. Nanya will be exhibiting on this topic, so maybe Nanya can tell a bit more about this. But for now, thank you and some references.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, so does anybody have something they would like to ask? Yeah, Annie?
Maybe not a question, but more of a statement of a connection between our research. But I had a participant who had a European background and migrated with her parents during the White Australia policy, and basically had an interesting experience of not speaking her language for 10 years. And then her cousin sent her a cassette tape of music in her native language, and she has this really profound memory of listening to the music on her Walkman and actually just falling apart in tears in the middle of the street. So I just think it's really interesting, that idea of performing culture through music, and yeah, definitely having that connection across our research. So yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Annie. And yeah, that's something music does, apparently. Bringing back these memories, and also it's a particular kind of Dutch culture that is performance. Thanks.
Can I just say, am I on?
Yes, you are. Yes.
But to say that I am a child of the assimilation period, so that I never learnt my own language properly. I'm sitting here in the Netherlands now, struggling in the Netherlands, and in Australia I always felt like I was struggling with English. So I felt in the end like an in-betweener and linguistically insecure in two languages, really, because that was the impact of that time. And we all had to leave school at 15, you know, so you couldn't really pick that up. So it was a lot of picking up to try and get to university level, but the in-between identity just hangs around me. So, you know, I think that's what I want to explore a lot of each time, how people are coping with that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, Charlie, a quick question, and then we'll move on.
I just have a quick one about the difference across the two groups. And you mentioned that they brought some items along with them. Was there any kind of representation of those differences that you've talked about in the material things that they brought that you noticed?
It was mainly the first generation that brought items.
Okay.
Yeah, which is interesting. Maybe the artifacts, it seemed like the artifacts had a different meaning to the sort of the multiculturalism who came later.
Yeah, how interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Jora. That was great. That was awesome. Thank you. And now we're going to turn to our last presentation, which is Annie Bernecker-Musgrove, and it is on Australian interculturalism in practice: how practitioners believe interculturalism and multiculturalism differ. Which I'm really interested to find out. So please.
Yeah. Thank you.
Could you remember to keep your chat thing open so you can see the message?
And I'm going to try and share my screen.
Excellent.
As well. See if you can all see that.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so as Kathy said, I'm Annie Bernecker-Musgrove, and I'm a PhD student at Swinburne University of Technology here in Melbourne. And my presentation is on Australian interculturalism in practice, how practitioners believe interculturalism and multiculturalism differ. So the information presented here is a very small part of my larger PhD case study, which is on Australian interculturalism in practice within the city of Ballarat. And this presentation will focus on how participants believe interculturalism and multiculturalism differ due to how they treat the principle of inclusion. So I'll be giving a very brief introduction to the topic, context, some of the relevant literature, the methodology, and then move on to my findings and conclusion. So interculturalism is a relatively new policy for viewing and managing cultural diversity at the local level. And as a policy, it prioritises contact and dialogue across cultural boundaries. And in 2017, the city of Ballarat became the first intercultural city in Australia through the Council of Europe's Intercultural Cities program. This particular change marked a significant shift in the Australian cultural diversity landscape, where, as we've heard today, multiculturalism remains quite a dominant policy. So, amongst the literature between interculturalism and multiculturalism, there's a pretty new debate going on about whether or not interculturalism can be viewed as a distinct policy in and of itself, or whether it is more of a dressed up version of multiculturalism with very little substantive difference. And this debate is happening with theorists across Europe and in Canada, and then also here in Australia. Overall, the debate remains inconclusive, and it doesn't consider what might happen when we look at practice. And so that's what I'm looking at here today. So to help answer the question of how practitioners believe interculturalism and multiculturalism differ in practice, I use a practice theory lens to help examine the introduction of intercultural policy in Ballarat. And I use a flat ontology and pragmatist epistemology to allow for the experiences of practitioners to be at the forefront of the study. And there's a distinct emphasis on looking at the different principles and how they hang together to form a practice. So I'm really zooming in on what practitioners do to implement interculturalism, what types of materials they use, whether it be funding or their relationships with different organisations, or competences, or in this case, meaning, when we look at how an intercultural lens transforms the meaning of inclusion. So this case study uses 12 interviews from local government staff and volunteers at the City of Ballarat, and it presents their understanding of interculturalism in practice. And it also highlights how they contrast their understanding of interculturalism with their understanding of multiculturalism. And it brings a practitioner perspective to a debate that, as I said, remains inconclusive in a conceptual sense. So one of the findings of the study was that participants believed inclusion was a principle that made interculturalism distinct and unique. So here, inclusion refers to how participants spoke about cultural diversity within Ballarat, and about accepting all people within the community. So participants also shared how they themselves felt more included by intercultural policy than prior policies such as multiculturalism. So during the interviews, they were asked about what they believed were the main principles of interculturalism, and overwhelmingly inclusion came up as one of the most important parts of their intercultural practices. And their responses illustrated a broader understanding of what inclusion meant and who inclusion included. So it didn't just speak to our traditional idea of CALD or culturally and linguistically diverse groups, but it also spoke about First Nation groups as well as Anglo-Australians, and basically included everybody. So a few participants referred to intercultural policy as a better fit for talking about cultural diversity within the Ballarat community. And one of the participants was a local government manager called Alex, and she explained this further when stating, "It does bring in all cultures, and I guess from the start, I loved it because I was in it as well." And so we weren't talking about a specific community. I wasn't talking about that Italian community or that Spanish community or that Sudanese community. It was a community that I was involved in and part of, and so perhaps that's why I liked it. So Alex's comments illustrated how participants understood intercultural policy as focusing on individual identities more so than cultural group identities. And her response reinforced the comments from other participants who also shared the view that implementing interculturalism actually affected their personal views of feeling included within the community that they were servicing. So participants characterised multiculturalism as practiced in Australia as actually not or less likely to nurture inclusion than interculturalism. And generally, participants suggested that interculturalism provided a more inclusive way of framing conversations about diversity in the community. Participants expressed that inclusion underpinned all of the intercultural policy's principles, making it a better fit to discuss the changing diversity that Ballarat experiences. And so Ballarat is a very small regional town in Western Victoria, and it only has about 10% of people coming from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. So participant perspectives of interculturalism were more often than not positioned against their understandings of multiculturalism. And while proponents of multiculturalism in the literature critiqued proponents of interculturalism for providing a caricature of multiculturalism, the perspectives of the participants showed that they kind of agreed with this caricature of multiculturalism in regards to the perceived risk of cultural self-segregation, which came up a lot as a concern for practitioners regarding the practice of multiculturalism. So in summary, the themes from this study showed how participants believed the implementation of an intercultural policy transformed their notion of inclusion, of including more than the traditional called migrants, but also including mainstream Australia, Anglo-Australians and First Nation people. And their responses show how they saw the broadening of inclusion as a principle, as a way to distinguish between interculturalism and multiculturalism in practice at the local government level. So in line with some of the theorists within the debate, participants believed that interculturalism gave greater emphasis to individual identities, leaving them feeling more included as practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was awesome. I have questions. Does anyone else have questions that they would like to ask? That was really, really great. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? Yeah, Jora?
Martina, you go first.
Okay, thanks. Hi, and thanks. That was a great paper, and it's a really fascinating question that I've also been thinking about over the years. And I wonder, and excuse me if that sounds cynical, but I wonder whether you've also been looking at the role of cultural intermediaries, consultants in selling this concept to local governments in Australia, because I do know a particular entity that has been flagging the concept a lot and selling it to local governments. And I just wonder whether you think that it's just as much about the packaging of this idea through a kind of professional consulting person than the actual content that makes it so successful. And the other question I'm interested in is whether I understand your approach and the importance of the practice theory, but I wonder whether you're also interested in then bringing that back to the findings, back to the theoretical debate.
Mm-hmm. So with the first part of the question, I understand what you mean, because I also did my honours on this topic, and so that kind of had a few interviews with kind of people at that level, whereas this is obviously about the local government staff and volunteers. And so with this particular case study of Ballarat, it actually was one particular person within the council who's been working at the council for quite a while who connected with the idea of interculturalism and then practiced it and brought it up with themselves, rather than a kind of third party coming into the council and trying to sell interculturalism to them. So that was a slightly different network or way that worked. And with the second question, it's definitely a part of the broader PhD study, which wasn't presented today, in terms of connecting it back with the theoretical debate particularly, and also with, for example, practice theory, and using the materials and meanings and competences to have a better understanding of how, well, what interculturalism looks like, and kind of create a fuller picture of the different components of and what interculturalism means for this particular area, which is very specific and so not as generalizable as some other places might have been. Yeah.
On mute, sorry. Can we have Jora and then afterwards Jeremy, please?
Yeah, looking at all the questions, this is very a hot topic, interculturalism, multiculturalism. And I think this is where our presentations nicely speak to each other, whereas we were more looking at the community and the group sort of identity. This is more the individual basis. And I wonder if you, and I think that's the main sort of critique on interculturalism, that it's too individual. And I wonder, and so that the group idea is sort of lost out of sight. And I wonder if you see that in your interviews as well. So, what do we do with this group sort of ethnic identity?
So I think it's interesting because it's obviously based in Ballarat, and so it's a regional Australian local government that has been practicing pretty kind of good practice or best practice in terms of the cultural diversity landscape. And they do speak to ideas of multiculturalism in terms of refugee settlement and having a language cafe. And so they're not chucking away multiculturalism in any way, or multicultural principles and practices. I do see it more as an integration of the two parts speaking to each other and trying to find a balance between group and individual identities, rather than, you know, forsaking one for the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Jeremy?
Oh, thanks. That was a wonderful presentation, really interesting. I wanted to ask a question about the landscape of agencies in Ballarat, and you know, whether the participants talked about that, because there's the Ballarat Regional Multiculturalism Council, and you know, West Papua and refugee advocacy groups, and also the community agencies, and all of them have sort of, they're accustomed to the paradigm of multiculturalism, you know. So, so was there anything in what your participants said that, you know, really suggested that there's some shift there or something interesting going on?
Well, the Ballarat Regional Multicultural Council came up a lot across the interviews as a really key actor or partner with the council in terms of actually being able to fund and get all of their kind of community-based practices and programs running. In terms of the idea of a shift, the participants did highlight the idea of, for example, they have a soccer league, which used to be called the Multicultural Soccer League, and it's now changed its name to Incultura. So small kind of minor things like that are what the participants are flagging in terms of, hey, maybe they're trying to latch on to this idea of Ballarat becoming a successful intercultural city and trying to brand themselves as such, and maybe trying to move towards that idea by using similar language to get a cohesiveness across the agencies versus the council. But I think it's actually quite early to tell, because I came in, so I think, so while Ballarat became an intercultural city in 2017, they officially launched their policy in September of 2018. And then I interviewed like the next year. So it's all quite early in terms of seeing a definite shift with those agencies. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to open it up for the last couple of minutes to see if anyone has any questions for any of the presenters now, because we've got about 5 minutes left. So does anyone have any questions that they didn't get to ask earlier? I wouldn't mind asking you, Jora, thinking about the groups of kind of Dutch Australians, did they feel like they were part of a Dutch community within Australia? Did they have a sense of community themselves over here? Or did they feel, I mean, and was there a difference between the different groups?
Yeah, interesting question. And that's where the data may be biased, because we recruited them at a community event. But yeah, some were talking about how this Dutch community event wasn't too important for them, and that they normally don't hang out with Dutch people. And this was the older people who we interviewed, who were hanging out just as much with non-Dutch people, and who were actually a bit cautious about, like, oh, you know, these are not necessarily the nicest people in the country.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions for any of the other presenters? No?
Yeah, I was wondering, you know, there's quite a few presentations on white Australia policy, multiculturalism, but also the intercultural framework. And like, what do we think as researchers? Which one is best? Is it the multicultural framework or the intercultural cities framework? I'm pretty sure it's not white Australia, but who knows? You know, what do we think? Do we have an opinion, or do we just kind of look at this from the outside? Does anyone have any answers to that?
I mean, I think it's a hard one. I think it is,
yeah.
I mean, I think there's issues with all of them, and I think that for me personally, I think that all of these kind of ideas of kind of I haven't found anything that to me seems to dislodge that dominant core.
No,
you know, so that I think is problematic. I don't know, and I mean, I'm a relatively new Australian. I've only been Australian for a few years. And it's very different to the UK, but it's also, yeah, I find it difficult. I don't think any of them are actually, to me, speaking to me. Martina, what would you like to say?
Yeah, just a quick thought, because no one else has to hand up. I do think that our role is to do exactly what Annie is doing, really, to see how these different concepts matter. So what is actually, I mean, well, there might be some political theorists here too, and I'm very intrigued by political theory, but as sociologists, I think we need to make sense of what these concepts mean in practice. And ultimately, I think it matters less whether we use this or that, you know, label, because when I listen to, and I think I know that some of these people in Ballarat that talk about interculturalism, when they talk about it, then I know that some of that is covered by multiculturalism. So, but it's no point, it's not about persuading practitioners, I think, about that we're right or so, but it's really kind of analysing what's going on, what do these concepts do in practice in that case.
Karen, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, that's because somebody is making holes in the wall next to me. Oh. So no, I'm really asking this question because I'm writing a final report this week with policy recommendations, and I'm just wondering, you know, I feel like I'm repeating the same policy recommendations that I have been repeating over the last years, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any new insights in this really you know, intelligent group of experts. Anything that you think in this case the federal government should know about multiculturalism and interculturalism and integration?
Big question. Does anyone have any ideas?
I know. Just, you know, from the top of your head.
Yeah, well, if I may jump on that.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer for you, Corinne, not the policy one.
Oh.
In fact, Charlie and I, who's in a room too,
yeah,
known. No, we're looking at multiculturalism and trying to understand it, and from a post-colonial perspective, and how these two worlds seem to be different worlds. And I really struggle combining these, and there is pros and cons doing it, and in my PhD I don't know how to do it, and this is maybe not yet for government, or I don't know, but it's really something I would like to see in academic discussions, how we look at multiculturalism from a post-colonial perspective. And there are definitions, there are excellent papers and books written on this, but still it seems to be a different kind of environment where this is talked about.
Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. We're going to have to wrap this up. Can I thank all of the presenters who were amazing, and thank you to all of the participants for taking part and joining in. It's been really, really great talking to you and hearing all your comments, and I've really enjoyed this session. I hope you all have too, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference in our virtual format. So enjoy, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.